I'd like to give you a few guidelines that are going to help you write QML code that is readable. On this documentation link, you're going to find some QML coding conventions, and they say that they are giving the coding conventions they follow in the documentation, and they do recommend us all to follow that because the code is going to be much more readable by others. Okay, so in your QML file, you're going to start by the ID. You're going to follow that with the property declarations. And down here, they have an example. So you see an ID here. We have a QML component. It has an ID that is shown here. You follow that with the properties. If you have any properties, you have to put them here. You follow that with signal declarations. After that, you're going to put in your JavaScript functions. Any JavaScript function that is embedded in your QML file should come here. And then you have the properties for the object. Okay, things like X, Y, width, and height should come here. If you have a lot of JavaScript that you want to assign to a property, you should wrap that in a block like this. And then after all this, you're going to put your child objects. You see this rectangle here is a child rectangle of the parent rectangle here. Down below, you put your states. This is basically what we did when we looked at states and transitions. And you end with the transitions that your element might have. This is the recommended way. You start with IDs, property declarations, signal declarations, JavaScript functions, object properties, child objects, states, and transitions. This is really how your QML code should be organized. Down below, they show you how you should use your grouped properties. You really shouldn't do something like this, anchors left, anchors top, anchors bottom, and things like that. You should group them like this and say anchors and specify the properties inside the brackets here. We looked at this syntax before. This is the recommended way to make your code much more readable. If a list only contains one element, you can omit the square bracket, something like this. Okay, instead of doing something like this, you see we have states. We have one state and we put that inside these brackets. You can do something like this and put your state inside directly if it happens to be only one state. Down here, they talk about things you should be careful about when writing some JavaScript in your QML code. If the script is a single expression, they recommend writing that in line, something like this. You see here, there is a binding to the width property of this rectangle here. If the script is a couple of lines, wrap that in a block. And if it is much longer, you need to wrap that in a function and call that when you want to assign something to a QML property like this. And if JavaScript is really too long, you need to put that in an external JavaScript file and import that in your QML file. And we looked at this before. Okay, these are the guidelines to help you write QML code that other people are going to be able to read very easily. And that adds value to the code that you write. If you write code that only you can read or that other people really find difficult to read, it is not a good thing for your piece of code. Okay, so keep this in mind. This being the last lecture of the course, there are two things I would like to recommend if you want to push your Qt Quick knowledge further. One is really to consult the documentation in Qt itself. The documentation in Qt is very good, and you saw that in the course. Every time we needed something, we just looked at the documentation, and we had tons and tons of information just by looking at the documentation in Qt Creator or online. So every time you need to learn about something, go in the documentation and see what you can find in there. This is the documentation for Qt Quick itself. You see here, they talk about some of the things we even talked about in the course: user input, positioning, states and transitions, data models, views, and data storage. We have looked at these things, but if you want to read about the canvas, you can read about this. They have particle and graphical effects. If you want to do some advanced animations, you can look at this. If you want to extend your QML with C++, these are good things to look at. One is the Qt documentation. The other is the book that we had a chance to look at in the course. And this is a very good book, and knowledge is presented in a very good structure. And I think if you have finished this course, you really have good ground to start looking at some of these things. This book has one downside, is that it tries and combines C++ and Qt in one go. If you don't have a C++ background, you're not going to find this very understandable. But if you want to get started with the C++ side of Qt, I happen to have a course on that, so if you are interested, be sure to check it out. And this is really all I have to offer in terms of tips and tricks on how to push your knowledge in Qt further. Consult the Qt documentation, look at this book, and try to look if you can learn something from these things. Okay, this brings us to the end of this course. I'd like to thank you for enrolling. If you like the course, please consider leaving your honest review. It helps a lot. And on top of all, I'm wishing you well on your journey as a Qt user interface developer. Till next time, bye.